So we now move into talking about culture and society, some ways in which culture and society were developing. And there's still some political aspects here as well. But one of the things that's going on here is a change of relationship between the papacy and these developing nations, which we've already kind of mentioned a little bit. We'll talk about two nations specifically, England and France. In the 1000s, the Normans had conquered, beginning from the time of the Norman invasion of the Anglo-Saxons in England, England had been gradually disassociating itself from the papacy. William the Conqueror, who leads the Norman conquest, had refused to swear fealty to the Pope, refused to recognize himself as the Pope's vassal. And even some of the bishops in England found ways to avoid obeying the dictates of the Pope. And that, of course, ended up with some controversy between the leaders of England, the king, and some bishops that wanted to remain faithful to the Pope. So, for example, Anselm of Canterbury, who we talked about with scholasticism, had to flee England several times because of his allegiance to the Pope. He refused to honor the king, and he refused to allow the king to appoint bishops. Eventually, though, England would make a distinction between the bishop's rights and the king's rights. In the 1100s, there was civil war in England, which allowed the church to have some independence because the king is too busy fighting the civil war, so he is not paying as close attention to what the church is doing. But after the Civil War, the kings tried to be more involved in the matters of the church, and try to reassert some of the privileges they had before. Henry II appoints a man named Thomas of Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury, kind of the highest ecclesiastical office in England. Becket immediately champions the church's position. All right, so Henry appoints him, and he immediately goes against Henry to support the church. The king tries to force Becket to do what he wants, but he refuses. He goes into exile.
What's that? Thomas what?
With a little...
What was the king's name?
Henry II. The Pope tries to get involved in this because he wants England stable, and so he tries to negotiate, is there a place with mediation here between the king and the archbishop? But it doesn't work. Ultimately, Becket goes so far as to excommunicate bishops that the king appointed. All right? And so the king appoints these bishops, and Becket says, you're out of the church. Eventually, there is some reconciliation between the two. Becket returns to Canterbury, but will still not appoint his bishops. And so noblemen end up assassinating him in his cathedral. The Pope threatens Henry with excommunication and goes so far to place the section of France controlled by the English king as what's known as under interdict, meaning the sacraments cannot be performed there. Right? He doesn't do it in England, but he does it in that little part of France that England has control over, and says that in that area, priests are not allowed to do the sacraments. That means none of your kids are getting baptized, none of you are getting married by the church, and if your people are dying, they don't get oil before they die. And so, this is pretty strong religious punishment in a sense. And eventually Henry is kind of forced to do penance because of this. And eventually Becket will be canonized as a saint, right? St. Thomas of Becket. Through the latter part of the 1300s, 1400s, there are other issues between the church and the English government. When Richard the Lionhearted goes on the Third Crusade, he's gone for about 10 years. The church leaders relish their independence, right? They don't have the king there trying to meddle in their affairs. King John was excommunicated by the Pope. Later he will become a papal vassal. This is the King John who 800 years ago signed the Magna Carta, which gave rights to the nobility and the church. But the Pope kind of disagreed with the Magna Carta and ended up, instead of getting support in England, he upset the Catholics in England. Right? They were actually supportive of the Magna Carta. England, of course, gradually moves to this more representative government known as Parliament. Right? So it's not just the monarchy. You have the House of Lords. The clergy were the Lords spiritually, and they had a voice in Parliament with other lords. Now, eventually, there would be a House of Commons, which would allow common people to have a voice in government as well. There were several attempts to control papal influence in England, and the Archbishop of Canterbury often found himself in a very difficult position, right, because of his position in England, but he's also supposed to obey the Pope. Kings were even suspicious sometimes of papal appointees to certain offices in England. And so the Pope was accused of filling these vacancies with foreigners instead of English Catholics. In France, the issue was a little bit different. The French monarchs, at least in this time, especially before 1300, were relatively weak. And so they often used their ties to the papacy to try and bring their bring stability to their rule. And of course, you have this whole thing with the King of France, right? The King of England, or the King of England. The King of England is also the Duke of Normandy. Right? And so in England, he's king. In France, he's a vassal to the King of France, who's closely allied with the Pope.
So that's still Henry II?
Roughly at this time, we're talking about a longer time period. And so it was several of the kings.
Isn't Duke of Normandy passed down from each king? It's not given to them.
It's not on particular.
It's like
You would pass along.
Okay.
Throughout the latter part of the Middle Ages, France's power began to increase. And the papacy was still closely tied to it and decided to lend more and more support to France. And because of this tie between the French and the papacy, France was given some rights over the church in France that were not allowed elsewhere. Right? So the Pope allowed some things to take place in France that weren't allowed in other places. Decisions about church leaders, for example. And of course, there's a lot of struggle between England and France this time, as we talked about with the 100 Years' War. Both sides attempted to claim it was a just war, right, that just war theology we've talked about. And during it, tried to tax churches, right, tried to get funds from churches to support the war. Eventually, a man named that takes the papal name Boniface VIII becomes Pope, after the previous Pope, Celestine V, resigns. One of the documents that he releases during this papacy forbids the collection of taxes from the clergy to a secular power. And so essentially he's trying to cut off this taxation of the church, getting the church's funds for the government. Well, this offends the King of France, a man named Philip IV, or also known as Philip the Fair. And so he decides that maybe the relationship between France and the papacy isn't as necessary. And so he begins to move away from the papacy. In fact, he starts supporting Boniface's enemies, right? The people that are kind of opposed to him. He will confiscate church lands. Right? appropriated them for the French government. He imprisons a bishop. And so, in response to this, Boniface issues a document called Unum Sanctum, the first two Latin words of it, which translates to one holy church. And so this document, one holy church. In it, Boniface claims universal power and authority. And so as the French king is trying to assert his rights, Boniface tries to make the claim for his universal power. In it, he states there is only one Catholic Church, and outside this church, there is no salvation or remission of sins. Essentially a warning here. If you're going to go against the Catholic Church, you're not going to have your sins forgiven. You're not going to be saved. Further on, he will state, there we declare, state, divine, and pronounce, right? Got to say it 4 times to make sure it's clear, that it is altogether necessary to salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman Pontiff. Everyone has to serve the Pope. And so Boniface decides he's going to excommunicate Philip. Boniface is kidnapped. His kidnappers parade him through the town in a very humiliated state, and that will lead to Boniface's death. There's a brief successor to Boniface, but after that, the French arranged for the election of Clement V. Clement adds to the College of Cardinals 23 French Catholics. Several of them are relatives. And also decides to move the papacy from Rome to the city of Avignon in France. For 70 years, the papacy is in France, in the city of Avignon. It's been referred to by some people as the Babylonian captivity of the church. Because sometimes popes tried to go back to Rome, but they were prohibited from going. Clement was succeeded by John the 23rd. And during John the 23rd's reign, he centralized the papacy, right? Really tried to consolidate power. But also, because of his difficult state, ended up making the Pope beholden to secular powers. And he put in place other things that allowed clerical, financial, and political abuse. Right? So he kind of sets the stage for clergy to abuse their power. He increased taxes on clergy that would go to the church and others, and 63% of the wealthy amassed went to the army in France. He was also evidently a very liberal excommunicator. He would excommunicate anybody very quickly. Later popes, after John the 23rd, would try to reform some of these things. They're not all of them. But all remained strongly tied to the French crown and thus stayed in Avignon.
Is it 22nd or 23rd?
John the 22nd, excuse me, John the 22nd. John the 23rd will appear later. After several popes, Urban V is elected to be pope in the year 1362. And he rules as pope from 1362 to 1370. Again, you don't necessarily need to know those dates. He actually travels to Rome, intending to stay there. But when he gets to Rome, he finds the people rioting and rejecting him as pope, and so he goes back to Avignon, right? Because the people don't apparently want him. In 1370, Gregory XI becomes pope, and he tries to return to Rome as well, but he too faces resistance. but ultimately makes the decision to stay in Rome. This is where the papacy belongs. There were a couple of things that the Avignon Papacy contributed to, or effects that it had. First was the increases in revenue. There were new methods of financial development that brought money into the church coffers. Things like taxes, ecclesiastical gifts, many of which were quid pro quos. If I give money to the church is going to do this for me. Money from vacant dioceses went to the papacy, right? So if a bishop died and it took a while to find that bishop, any sort of money collected in that area didn't stay in the diocese, it went to the pope, which kind of was an encouragement to keep that diocese empty, right? Because that money goes to the pope. Indulgences, right? We talked about before, this money paid so that the afterlife would be affected. Was another way that money went into the church coffers. Money was received from revenues, ecclesiastical offices being emptied, right? So increases in revenue. It also evidenced the increased power of the cardinals. The cardinals shared in the revenues that came to Avignon. And when there were fewer cardinals, of course, the share was bigger, but eventually the cardinals started to get more and more numerous. Eventually the cardinals will create a rule limiting their number, right? There can only be so many cardinals. And there were several papal attempts at trying to reform the cardinals, but they were met with resistance. With the rise of the cardinals' power, the bishop's power went down. And bishops now were only by papal appointment. The last effect, but perhaps the most profound one, is what's known as the Great Western Schism. The Great Western Schism starts with the death of Gregory XI in 1378. When Gregory died, there was some confusion. Who's going to succeed the Pope? Well, most of the cardinals by this time were French. They're concerned about their situation, and so they go to France and elect a French Pope. Rome erupts in violence. They choose, so the French cardinals choose a Pope. The other cardinals choose a man named Urban VI, who is an Italian. He rails against the authority of the cardinals and complains about the authority of the bishops. And he's trying to gain some of the papal authority that's been lost. Well, the cardinals leave Rome and decide to elect a new pope named Clement VII. So you have Urban in Rome and Clement in Avignon. Well, all the cardinals have left Urban, so Urban selects new cardinals. So you have a College of Cardinals in Rome, College of Cardinals in France. Clement attacks Urban militarily, loses, goes back to Avignon. The sides are taken in Europe, right? The different countries siding with different individuals. Urban dies. So his cardinals elect a man that takes the name Boniface IX. Apparently he was kind of corrupt. There's an increase in the buying and selling of church offices during this time. And so each of these rival popes need money, so the buying and selling of church offices is, it's rampant. But with having two popes, there's this other group that's saying, okay, well, how do we fix this? Right? How do we get back to one pope? And so one of the theories is, okay, let's have both of them resign, and we'll elect a new pope. And so there's attempts to negotiate between the two sides and call for a general council that will make this decision. Clement VII dies. Right? Boniface IX is the Roman pope. Clement VII, the Avignon pope, dies. King Charles VI of France asked the Avignon cardinals not to elect a pope. They don't elect a pope, it'll solve the problem. They elect a pope. The French king tries to encourage his people to withdraw support from Benedict XIII, who would later be declared an anti-pope. An anti-pope refers to an individual who took the name pope, but was not officially within the line of apostolic succession. Right, so the officially recognized pope during this time was Boniface IX, but contemporarily, people in France said, this is the guy, right, and the pope is Benedict XIII. When Boniface dies, Gregory XII is elected. Right, so you still have this two cardinals, two popes. And he won't meet with Benedict to try and solve the issue. Within this is the development of a conciliar movement. Right? Trying to find a council that will solve this problem. And eventually this idea turns into a belief that the council, a universal council, has more authority than the Pope, which was very similar to what the Eastern Orthodox viewed. But who can call such a council? Because neither one of these popes is going to call a council to try and solve this problem. So the cardinals decide, let's end this split and call a council. And so the cardinals call a council for the city of Pisa in the year 1409. Because of this, Benedict and Gregory both try to call rival councils. Nobody listens to them practically. Right? So everybody's looking to the College of Cardinals. In the Council of Pisa, with the support of the cardinals and the support of the European rulers, Benedict and Gregory are deposed and Alexander V is elected. If you are keeping score at home, that now gives us 3 popes.
So,
because Benedict and Gregory are not going to agree to step down from being pope.
Boniface had already died.
Boniface had died and Gregory had been elected in his place. Now, Alexander has the support of most people, but Benedict and Gregory still have some significant support. Right? So it's not like the other two suddenly lose all their support. Alexander V dies, and John, that should be 23rd, there should be an X here, another X. John the 23rd, this is where we get John the 23rd, he's elected. He will later be an anti-pope.
Right, this is after Alexander died?
This is after Alexander dies, so there are still 3 popes.
This is confusing where I'm from notes, much less living.
Another council is called the Council of Constance in 1414. John the 23rd is encouraged to abdicate. Just give up. The other 2 are deposed. Right? Gregory XII agrees to resign. Benedict XIII, however, flees and goes into exile. He will eventually die without a successor. Nobody named Pope after him. And in place, Martin V is elected. And so we're now back to one Pope. And so all that confusion, eventually it's decided, let's convene a general council every 7 years. And that incoming popes have to promise to reform the church. So things like this don't happen. It doesn't last very long because the popes quickly disagree with it. So it ends very quickly as later troubles come up. We'll end there today. We'll pick up on Tuesday. We're talking about the Renaissance and the Renaissance's contributions to Christianity, Christianity's contributions to the Renaissance. Don't forget the next reflection paper due tomorrow.